Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. There's lots more to come. The legend of Julia Legare is one of the most popular ghost stories in South Carolina. She came to Edisto Island in 1852 to visit her family's plantation. The young girl was having a good time on holiday, but it was tragically cut short when she came down with a mysterious illness. As the days went on, Julia's sickness became worse and worse, until finally, she slipped into a coma. Her family tried to care for her as best they could, but in those days there were a lot of things medicine couldn't cure. They anxiously waited for the day when the young girl to recover, but that day never came. The family physician came to examine the young girl, and it was with a heavy heart that he broke the sad news to the family. Julia Legare was dead. The child was lovingly dressed in her best clothes for the funeral, where her loved ones would have the chance to say one last goodbye. Or so they thought. At that time, when people passed away, they were not treated with embalming fluids to preserve the body before burial. Instead, the dead were buried quickly to avoid spreading disease. And young Julia Legare was buried on the day she died, after her loved ones had a chance to pay their respects. After the funeral, her body was taken from the church and sealed up in the family's mausoleum. They placed her in the tomb, then sealed up the marble door and locked it behind them. That night, members of the church thought they could hear faint screams and the sound of crying coming from the direction of the old graveyard, but no one ever investigated the strange noises. After 15 years had gone by, another death in the family required the mausoleum to be opened. It was then that the family realized what a tragic error they had made. Some 15 years later, there was another death in the Legare family member. After the funeral, the mausoleum was reopened so that the dead person could be interred. However, when they unsealed the heavy marble door and looked inside, they were shocked to see a small skeleton lying crumpled on the ground. It was huddled by the door, and the hands were outstretched as if it had been trying to claw its way out. To their horror, they realized that it was Julia. She had still been alive when they sealed her in the tomb all those years ago. The doctor must have been wrong. She wasn't dead, she was just in a coma. When she awoke in the mausoleum, she was probably terrified and tried to escape by scratching on the door. The poor girl's remains were entombed once again, as were those of the relative whose death led to the grim discovery, and the door was securely closed. Still reeling from the horrible discovery, the girl's family members visited cemetery the next day to pay their respects. When they did, they found the door of the mausoleum was standing open. Thinking that someone must have forgotten to lock it, they shut the door again and walked away. A few weeks later, the door was open again. This happened over and over throughout the decades. Chains and unbreakable locks were used to keep it sealed tight, but they would always break and the door would be found standing open. It seemed that the ghost of Julia Legare would not allow it to remain closed. Visitors still head out to the Edisto Island every year, just to explore the cemetery and take a look at the famous mausoleum. Walking inside the tomb is just fine, but don't ever think about shutting the door. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go out to Edisto Island and explore the old Presbyterian church. We had all heard the legend of Julia Legare, and we wanted to find out if the place was really haunted. While I was in the mausoleum, taking a look around, my friends thought it would be funny to play a prank on me. They shut the giant stone door behind me and left me trapped inside. As I stood in the darkness, I heard them laughing outside, and I thought they would let me out after a while. Instead, I heard them say they would come back and pick me up in the morning. They left me there. I couldn't believe it. I began to get creeped out and started pushing against the door with all my strength, but it just wouldn't budge. It had taken all 4 of my friends to shut it in the first place. I couldn't see anything in the pitch black. Nervously, I sat down and resigned myself to spending the night trapped in the mausoleum. Normally, I'm not the kind of person who frightens easily, but sitting there in that cramped tomb, surrounded by the darkness and the gloom, I began to panic. It felt like there was a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I sat there trembling in the dark for what seemed like hours. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as time went on, the scratching became more and more frantic. I huddled in one of the corners and tried to cover my ears, but I couldn't block out the unnerving sound. It kept growing louder and louder. Then, just as I thought I was about to lose my mind, a terrible scream echoed through the darkness. It chilled me to the bone. It was a long and mournful wail that was filled with unbearable pain and fear. In the silence that followed, I could make out the sound of a young girl sobbing quietly to herself. It was the pitiful crying of someone who had been left without a shred of hope. In that moment, I felt such sorrow and pain that I think I forgot my fear. Her suffering seemed to resonate, and inexplicably, I found myself wanting to reach out and comfort her. However, I couldn't bring myself to do it for fear of what I might touch in the darkness. When I was young, my parents lived in a house that had been built in the 1920s. One evening, my parents had gone out and I was alone in the house. I was lying in bed trying to get to sleep. My bedroom door was open, and from my bed I could see all the way down the hall to the front door. I rolled over in bed to get comfortable, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something at the end of the hallway. All these years later, it still gives me goosebumps to think about it. There was a black, shadowy figure, but it was vague and indistinct. It was in the shape of a man, but it looked like black squiggles, like when someone scribbles a human shape on a piece of paper. But the squiggles were moving, like static or electricity or animation. That's the best way I can describe it. There was no sound. It was eerily silent. Then the Squiggle Man noticed me looking at him. He reached out and began beckoning towards me. I was so scared I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. All of a sudden, it just came rushing down the hall towards me. I was just frozen, petrified with fear. As soon as it reached the doorway to my bedroom, the door suddenly slammed shut on it with a loud bang. I screamed and yelled for my parents, but they weren't home. It was one of the few moments in my life when I was scared out of my mind and couldn't comprehend what I had just seen. I opened my bedroom window and scrambled outside. I didn't go back into the house until my parents got home about an hour later. I didn't believe in ghosts then, and I don't know if I believe in them now, but I know I saw something. I just don't know what that something was. This happened when I was a college student. I was on my way home when I was stopped by a little girl. She looked like she was about 5 or 6. She grabbed my hand and started pulling. "Please come," she begged. "My mom needs help." I don't know why, but for some reason I went with her. The little girl dragged me by the hand for 4 or 5 blocks until we arrived at a park. There were trees, benches, swings, and a jungle gym. Perhaps because it was nearly dusk, the park seemed to be empty. The girl wouldn't let go of my hand and she dragged me towards the jungle gym. Nearby, I noticed a woman sitting on a bench under a tree. From where I was standing, I couldn't see her face because the branches of the tree were covering it. "I brought someone, Mom," the little girl called cheerfully. The woman on the bench didn't move. From behind the branches of the tree, I heard her say, "I'm sorry, it's my daughter." There was something about the woman's voice that sent a chill down my spine. I felt like something was very, very wrong. I just wanted to get away from there as fast as possible. The little girl said, "Come play with me," and she ran over to the jungle gym. "I'm sorry, it's my daughter," said the woman again in a dull monotone. I still couldn't see her face. Something about the way she was sitting made me nervous. I broke out into a cold sweat. The little girl was playing on the jungle gym behind me. The sun was beginning to set and it was growing darker. "Why did you tell your daughter to bring me here?" I asked. "Why me?" At that moment, the woman suddenly screamed out, "Jenny!" There was a dull thud and I looked back the jungle gym behind me. The little girl had fallen and she lay motionless on the ground. Her face was pale and her eyes were wide open. Her breath was coming in small gasps. As I watched in horror, a pool of blood began to spread out on the ground around her head. I wanted to call the police, an ambulance, anything, but I was paralyzed by fear. I couldn't move. I looked back at the park bench. The woman sat there motionless. I couldn't understand why she didn't help her daughter. I reached out and pulled back the branches of the tree that were obscuring her face. What I saw made me scream out in terror. It was the face of a dead woman. Her face was purple, her eyes were bulging out, and her tongue was protruding between her swollen lips. There was a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and the end of it was tied to the branches of the tree above her. She had strangled herself. The woman's mouth opened and she mumbled, "I'm sorry, it's my daughter." I don't remember much after that. I think I must have fainted. When I came back to my senses, I was lying on the ground. It was very dark and the park was deserted. I picked myself up and hurried home. Later, I found out that a woman had ended her life in that park years before. Her daughter died in an accident and she blamed herself. The poor woman was so distraught that she took her own life. The jungle gym has been demolished since then, but I will never forget what I saw. One dark night, a 15-year-old girl named Lydia was walking home from her friend's house. She turned down a narrow street to take a shortcut and was startled by the sight of an old man standing in her path. When she stopped, the old man turned to her and in a hoarse voice said, "Tell me the way." His face was disgusting, his skin covered in scars and boils, his hair stringy and unkempt, his eyes bulging horribly, almost popping out of their sockets. Lydia was terrified. She was alone in a dark and narrow alleyway with a strange and disturbing person. Her heart began pounding and it took her a few seconds to catch her breath. "Tell me the way," the old man demanded. "Okay, where are you going?" asked Lydia nervously. When the old man told her the address he was searching for, a chill ran down her spine. It was her house. "I don't know where that is," she replied curtly as she pushed past the old man and ran down the alleyway. Glancing back, she could see him standing in the alley, watching her flee. Lydia was so freaked out by the incident that she didn't stop running until she got back to her house. Breathing a sigh of relief, she took out her keys. She looked up and down the street to make sure the old man hadn't followed her. It was empty. She turned the key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. From the darkness inside her house, a hoarse voice said, "Tell me the way." When I was in 6th grade, our entire class went on a school trip. All of the kids in the class were taking pictures with cameras and phones. When we returned to school, we were browsing through the photographs when, all of a sudden, one girl said, "Hey, what's that?" Everyone scrambled to see what she was looking at. In the photograph, one of the boys in our class was sitting on the bus. There didn't seem to be anything strange about the picture until you looked very closely at his reflection in the window. His face in the reflection looked as if it was yellow and bulging, bubbling and mutating, and there appeared to be a strange white shape floating beside him. When you turned the picture upside down, you realized it was a skull. It was horrific. When the boy saw the photograph of himself, he burst into tears and had a panic attack. Everyone else in the class began to freak out. The teacher had to send the boy to the school nurse, and the principal banned all of us from speaking about the strange photo. Everyone was scared. 7 days later, the boy died of a brain tumor.